The deputy folded the reins around his saddle horn so his hands would be free, and then he did not use them. He held the paper at his side and watched the woman come out of the half-finished dugout, wiping her palms on a rag that was already dark with dirt. Behind her, the stovepipe knocked against the roof in the wind. 44 cattle stood along the fence in a line so still they looked painted there. The deputy could smell the dust, and under it, something green and sweet from a cornfield that had no business being green this late in the season. He held out the notice. She took it with hands that did not shake, and the deputy could not decide if that made him feel better or worse about what he had just done. Clara Voss Danner stood in front of the half-finished dugout on the flat above Sweetwater Creek with a folded notice in her hand and 44 cattle she could not feed. September heat pressed down on Wheeler County like a palm against a chest. The deputy who had delivered the paper was already riding south toward Mobeetie, and the dust his horse raised hung in the air longer than his sympathy had. 3 weeks earlier, Ellis Danner had died. A horse rolled on him during a night roundup 12 miles east, crushed his ribs into his lungs, and left him coughing blood in the dirt, while 2 cowboys held a lantern over his face. He was dead before they got him onto a wagon. He was 29 years old, and what he left behind fit on a single page. 44 head of cattle, 2 horses, 1 mule with a swollen shoulder, a 9-acre patch of corn too green to harvest, a lease on a quarter section with a windmill frame that had never been finished, and a note of $138 held by a man in Mobeetie named Judd Sykes. Clara had not cried at the burial. She had stood beside the raw dirt in a black dress she had sewn for her mother's funeral 2 years before, and watched men she barely knew lower her husband into ground so dry it cracked at the edges of the hole. The preacher said something about green pastures. Clara looked at the brown grass around the cemetery and thought about how quickly a lie could be spoken over a dead man. Now she unfolded the notice. Sykes had given her until spring delivery to settle the debt. The language was polite the way a knife is polite when it is still in the sheath. If the herd failed, the lease reverted. If the lease reverted, the windmill frame, the shed, the water access, and the dugout went with it. Everything Ellis had built in 2 years of labor would pass to the man who had lent him money to build it. Clara did the math the way her father had taught her to do math, which was out loud, on her fingers, with no comfort allowed. She had $31 in coin. She had less than 4 tons of poor hay cut in June, and stacked against the shed wall where mice had already tunneled into the bottom bales. She had 8 sacks of cottonseed cake, bought on Ellis's last trip to town. She had a cornfield that should have been golden by now, but stood green and heavy with moisture because the rains had come late, and the heat had come early, and the stalks had grown tall without ripening. And she had 6 weeks before frost. The cattle stood along the fence in a ragged line, their ribs beginning to show through hides that should have been sleek. The grass on the quarter section was brittle and cropped to the roots. Beyond the fence, the open range looked no better. Every cow in Wheeler County was eating the same exhausted ground, and the big outfits had 10,000 mouths where Clara had 44. The range was overstocked, overgrazed, and overdue for a reckoning that every cattleman could smell coming the way you smell rain before it falls. Except this was not rain. This was the smell of dirt where grass used to be. Clara folded the notice and put it in her apron pocket. She walked to the corn patch and broke a stalk at the joint. It snapped wet. The inside was pale green, the kernels soft as blisters, weeks away from the hard yellow grain that could be ground into meal or fed as ear corn. If she waited for the corn to ripen, frost would likely kill it first. If frost did not kill it, she would have maybe 12 bushels of grain from 9 acres of thin soil. 12 bushels would feed her. It would not feed 44 cattle for a single week. She squeezed the broken stalk. Juice ran between her fingers, sweet and raw. Something moved in the back of her mind. Not a plan. Not yet. Just the smell of her father's cellar in Fayette County, where cabbages sat under brine in stoneware crocks, and the air tasted of vinegar and cool stone. Her father pressing a wooden weight onto shredded cabbage and saying, in the clipped German English he never fully shed, that air was the enemy of keeping. That salt and weight could hold what air would spoil. She did not know yet what to do with that memory. She dropped the stalk and went inside to count her sacks of cottonseed cake for the third time, as if counting could make 8 become 20. 5 days after the notice arrived, Amos Rudd rode in. Rudd was 58 years old, had bossed trail drives from the Brazos to Dodge City, and owned more cattle than any 3 men in the county combined. He wore authority the way some men wore hats, tilted slightly forward so you could not miss it. He had known Ellis. He had sold Ellis 2 of his breeding cows at a fair price, which in Rudd's mind created an obligation that extended past the grave and into the affairs of the widow. He did not dismount. He sat his horse beside the shed and looked at the place the way a doctor looks at a patient he has already decided cannot be saved. Clara came out wiping her hands on a rag. She did not invite him down. She had learned in 3 weeks of widowhood that men who dismounted stayed longer, and men who stayed longer gave more advice. And advice from men who would not lend money was a luxury she could not afford to entertain. Rudd pointed at the shed roof. That ridge beam is split. You get a north wind with weight behind it, you lose the whole south face. I know, Clara said. He pointed at the stackyard. 4 tons, maybe 3.5 after the mice. That is not enough hay to carry 10 head through a mild winter, let alone 44 through a hard one. I know that too. Rudd shifted in his saddle and looked at the cornfield. That corn is 6 weeks from grain. You will not get 6 weeks. First frost comes mid-October in a good year, earlier in a bad one, and this is not a good year. Clara waited. Your calves are late, Rudd said. Your cows are thin. Your north fence is down in 2 places, which means when cattle start drifting south in a norther, yours will mix with range stock and you will never cut them back. Your windmill is a frame and a promise. Your well works, but one woman cannot haul enough water by hand for 44 head and keep anything else alive. You rode 12 miles to tell me what I already know, Clara said. What I need to know is what to do about it. Rudd looked at her with the expression men used when a woman asked a practical question they had expected to answer with sympathy. Sell the weak ones now, he said. The yearlings and the late calves. That gives you maybe $60, $70 if you find a buyer before everyone else starts selling. Use that to buy hay. Cut your herd to 30. Pray the winter is short. And if it is not short, then you pray harder. Amos, Clara said, and she used his first name because she was tired and because formality had not kept her husband alive, and she did not see what it could do for her cattle. If I sell the yearlings, I lose my breeding stock for next year. If I sell the calves, I lose the only growth I have. If I buy hay at September prices, I pay twice what it cost in June, and I still will not have enough. You are telling me to shrink until there is nothing left to shrink. Rudd pulled his hat down against the sun. I'm telling you what a real ranch does. Cut hay in June, buy cake in August, move cattle before snow. You are 3 months behind on work that takes a year to do right. My husband died 3 weeks ago. The grass does not care when your husband died. That was the sentence that stayed in Clara's chest after Rudd rode away. Not because it was cruel, because it was true. The grass did not care. The cold would not care. The cattle standing along the fence, chewing at dirt and fence posts, would not care about Ellis or the note or the split ridge beam or Clara's $31. They would eat or they would die, and the arithmetic between those two outcomes was simple and merciless. She needed at least 30 tons of reliable feed to carry the herd through a hard winter. She had less than 4 tons of hay and 8 sacks of cottonseed cake. The gap between what she had and what she needed was a canyon, and every cattleman in Wheeler County was staring into the same canyon. The difference was that they had hay, credit, or enough range to gamble on open grass. Clara had none of those things. She also could not leave. She had no family with room for her east of the Brazos. She had no money for passage. If she abandoned the cattle and walked away, the debt followed her, because Sykes held paper on the stock, not the land, and selling cattle without settling the note was something a judge in Moby T would call theft. She was tied to this quarter section the way a post is tied to the ground. The only direction she could move was down. That night, Clara sat on the dugout step and listened to the cattle breathe in the dark. Somewhere north, coyotes spoke to each other in short, rising sentences. The stars were hard and white. The air smelled of dust and dry grass and something else, something faintly sweet that she realized was coming from the cornfield where 9 acres of green stalks were exhaling moisture into the cooling night. She thought about her father's cellar again, cabbage under brine, sausage under smoke, corn under what? She did not have an answer, but the question would not leave. The answer came through failure. 6 days after Rudd's visit, Clara cut a test row of corn. She used Ellis's sickle, which was dull enough to turn the work into punishment, and she dragged the heavy green stalks to a spot behind the shed where she propped them into shocks the way she had seen farmers do in Fayette County. The idea was simple. Let the stalks dry in the wind, then feed the dried fodder to the cattle through winter. 3 days later, she pulled the shocks apart. The outer stalks were stiff and bleached where the sun hit them, but inside, where the leaves pressed against each other, the corn was sour and slick. Gray mold furred the joints. The ears were soft and dark. The smell was wet rot, the kind of smell that made cattle turn their heads away. Wallace Kerr happened to be riding the fence line that bordered Clara's quarter section. He was 35, owned a small place 3 miles east, and had the nervous disposition of a man who had just enough to lose. He stopped his horse and looked at the ruined shocks. "That is what wet corn does," Wallace said. "It rots. You cannot shock green corn in Texas heat and expect it to cure. The humidity holds the moisture in. The mold gets ahead of the drying." "I can see that," Clara said. "Your husband knew that. Everyone knows that. You cut corn when it is ripe and hard, or you leave it standing." Clara did not answer Wallace. She was holding a broken stalk, and the smell coming from the joint was not only rot. Under the sourness, there was something sharper, something that reminded her of the tang in her father's sauerkraut crock when the lid came off in January. Not death, fermentation. The stalk had not simply decayed. Part of it had soured the way cabbage sours, the way apple cider turns if you seal the jug. She pressed the stalk to her nose. The sharp smell was at the core, where the moisture had been trapped and the air had not reached. The rot was on the outside, where wind and sun had cracked the surface and let mold in. The inside, where weight and wetness had held, was different. Clara dropped the stalk and stood very still in the heat behind the shed, while Wallace Kerr watched her with the wary expression of a man who suspects a woman is about to say something that will require him to argue. "What if the rot is not the problem?" Clara said. "What if the rot is what happens when you do it wrong?" "Do what wrong?" "Keep green feed." Wallace shook his head. Green feed does not keep. That is not an opinion. That is what happens. Cabbage does not keep either, Clara said. Unless you cut it, salt it, weight it, and seal it from air. Then it keeps all winter. Wallace stared at her. You want to make sauerkraut out of corn. I want to keep the air out and let the souring do the work instead of the rot. Clara, that is. Wallace stopped. He was not a cruel man, and the widow standing in front of him with mold on her hands and a dead husband's sickle at her feet was not someone he wanted to mock. But the idea sounded like grief talking. That is not how cattle feed works, he finished. Clara did not argue. She went inside. The next morning, she rode the mule to Mobidi. The mule's shoulder was bad enough that the animal listed to the right on downhill stretches, and the 12-mile ride took most of the morning. Clara tied up outside the general store and went in to ask if anyone had agricultural papers. The storekeeper, a man named Pruitt, who sold everything from nails to patent medicine, pointed to a shelf where old newspapers and journals were stacked for wrapping purchases. Clara sorted through them. Most were copies of the Fort Worth Gazette and cattle trade circulars. But near the bottom, she found 3 torn pages from a copy of the Country Gentleman, dated 1884, used as packing around a set of lamp chimneys. The pages were incomplete. One column discussed the Ensilage question and referenced French and German farmers who preserved green maize in pits. Another mentioned sour fodder, fed to dairy cattle in the northern states. The technical details were fragments, mentions of trenches, of weight, of fermentation, of excluding air, but the principle was clear enough to confirm what Clara had smelled in the broken stalk. Green plant material, cut and packed and sealed from oxygen, did not rot. It soured, and cattle ate it. She was reading the torn pages at the counter when Judd Sykes walked in. Sykes was 43, built like a fence post, and owned the feed business in Mobidi. He sold hay, cottonseed cake, and grain at prices that reflected the fact that he was the only man selling. He also held Clara's note, which made him not just her creditor, but her most dangerous neighbor, because everything that weakened Clara strengthened Sykes. If her cattle died, he bought her lease. If she could not pay, he bought her cattle. Every failure of hers was a deposit in his account. He leaned against the counter and looked at the torn pages in Clara's hands. Reading Yankee farm tricks now, he said. That going to pay the note or just pass the time? Clara folded the pages and put them in her pocket. Your cattle are chewing fence posts, Sykes said. I saw them on the way in. A man with sense would sell the weak ones before they are worth less than the trouble of burying them. I'm not a man. No, you're not. A man would not be reading about French holes in the ground while his herd starves. Clara paid Pruitt 2 cents for the torn pages and walked out. Sykes watched her go with the flat, patient expression of a man who had learned that hunger was the best salesman and winter was his partner. Baptiste Leroux appeared on a Tuesday. Clara was in the cornfield with the dull sickle, cutting another test row and trying to calculate how many stalks she could chop and pack before the first frost killed what she had not cut. The math was brutal. 9 acres of corn, 1 woman, 1 dull blade, 6 weeks. Even if the idea worked, the labor was impossible. She heard the creak of a wagon axle before she saw him. An old freight wagon came along the track from the south, pulled by 2 mismatched horses and driven by a man who looked like he had been assembled from spare parts. Long arms, narrow shoulders, a face the color and texture of a saddle that had been left in the rain. He was 62 years old, though he looked older, and he wore a hat so shapeless it appeared to be melting. The wagon stopped because the left front wheel had begun to wobble, and the track past Clara's place was rutted enough to shake loose anything that was not tight, Baptiste climbed down, inspected the wheel, and said something in French that Clara did not understand but recognized by tone as profanity. Clara walked to the fence. "There is a post driver in the shed if you need to hammer the pin." Baptiste looked at her, then at the cornfield behind her, then at the cut stalks drying on the ground. His eyes stayed on the stalks. "You are cutting green," he said. His English was accented but clear, the consonants bitten off the way Alsatian speakers bit them. "I am." "For what?" "It will not dry." "I know it will not dry." Baptiste pulled the wheel pin, examined it, and set it on the wagon tongue. Then he looked at the stalks again. "You mean to save it green," he said. It was not a question. Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not hope. Something more careful than hope. Recognition. "I read about it," she said. "French farmers, pits in the ground, green maize packed and covered." "Not just French," Baptiste said. "Alsatian. My father kept a dairy outside Strasbourg. I was 12 when he built a trench and filled it with green corn. The neighbors said he had gone mad. The cows ate it all winter." He fixed his wheel pin, climbed back onto the wagon, and drove away. Clara stood at the fence watching the dust settle and feeling the idea in her chest grow from a fragment into something with weight. He came back the next morning. He brought a broken wagon tongue that he said needed mending at the forge in Mobiti, which was true, but which did not explain why he stopped at Clara's field first. He walked the cornfield without asking permission, breaking stalks at intervals, smelling the joints, pressing the ears between his thumb and finger. "Soft dough," he said. "Too wet for grain, but good for the trench if you manage the moisture. My father cut at this stage. The sugar is high. The stalk is heavy. You lose the grain, but you save the feed." "Will it work here?" Clara asked. "The ground is different. The heat is different. The principle is not different. You cut. You chop. You pack tight. You cover heavy. You keep the air out. The plant sours instead of rotting. The acid preserves it. This is not magic. This is what happens when sugar ferments without oxygen." He showed her with a handful of chopped stalks. He pulled his belt knife, cut a stalk into thumb-length pieces, packed them into an empty coffee tin he took from his wagon, pressed them down with his fist until juice welled up between the pieces, capped the tin with a disc of wet clay, and set it beside Clara's stove. 3 days, he said. "Open it. If it smells like vinegar and bread, it works. If it smells like death, the seal failed." Clara looked at the tin on the floor beside the stove. "And if it works, I have to do this with 9 acres of corn and no help." "You have a mule. The mule has a bad shoulder. You have 2 horses. I have 2 horses that I also need alive in spring." Baptiste sat on the stump outside the dugout and looked at the cornfield in the evening light. The stalks threw long shadows across the cracked dirt. "You also have me," he said. "For a while. I owe a delivery in Tascosa by October, but until then I have nothing to haul and nowhere to be." "Why?" Clara asked. "Why what?" "Why would you help me? You do not know me." Baptiste looked at her with the expression of a man who had been asked a question he found slightly insulting. "You are doing a thing I have seen done once before, and you are doing it alone, and you are doing it because you have no other choice. I am not helping you because I am kind. I am helping you because you are not stupid, and watching a person who is not stupid fail because they had no one to sharpen the knife is the worst thing I know how to watch." He taught her 3 things that first evening. The first was cutting length. Stalks had to be chopped short enough to pack without air pockets, no longer than a man's thumb. Long pieces left gaps. Gaps held air. Air meant rot. The second was layer discipline. Fill the trench in thin layers, each one trampled by weight before the next goes in, because the bottom must be as tight as the top. The third was edge attention. The place where the corn met the trench wall was where failure started, because earth crumbled and air crept in at the seam. He made Clara press a fence post into an imaginary corner to show her the motion. "The pit must be tighter than doubt," he said. Clara calculated the risk that night by lantern light. If she cut the corn green, she lost any chance of cornmeal for herself. If the trench failed, she would have buried her only remaining feed source, and the cattle would have nothing. If she waited for grain and frost came first, she lost everything anyway. The gamble was not between a safe choice and a dangerous one. It was between two dangerous choices, and one of them had a man who had seen it work standing in her yard. She decided before dawn. She would cut the field green, build a trench, pack it, seal it, and bet her herd and her future on controlled rot in the ground. If it worked, she had feed. If it failed, Sykes would own everything she had left, and she would walk away from Wheeler County with nothing but a dead man's name and $31. The mockery started before the first shovel broke ground. Two cowboys from the LX range, riding south along the creek trail, stopped their horses at the fence and watched Clara drag bundles of cut green corn toward a staked-out rectangle of bare dirt. One of them pushed his hat back and turned to the other. "What is she doing?" "Looks like she's burying her cornfield." "Burying it?" "Cut it green, and she is dragging it to a hole that is not dug yet. She is burying summer because she cannot stack winter." They laughed. Not meanly exactly, but with the easy confidence of men who worked for a brand that had 10,000 cattle and a foreman who made decisions for them. The idea that a lone widow could solve the feed problem that had every rancher in the panhandle sweating was not offensive to them. It was funny the way a child's drawing of a horse is funny. You could see what she meant. You could also see that it was not a horse. Clara heard them. She did not look up. She dragged the next bundle to the line and went back for another. Wallace Kerr came to the fence that afternoon. He had been thinking since their last conversation, and thinking had not improved his opinion. "Clara," he said, and his voice had the careful tone of a man delivering a warning he hoped would be received as kindness. "I have been turning your idea over, and I need to tell you what I think." "Tell me." "Wet corn in the ground will rot. Texas ground cracks when it dries. Every crack lets air in. Coyotes dig. Rain seeps. Sour feed founders cows. I have seen cattle bloat and die on spoiled grain, and what you are describing is spoiled grain on purpose. It is not spoiled grain. It is fermented fodder." "That is the same thing said sideways." "No," Clara said. "Spoiled is what happens when air stays in. Fermented is what happens when air stays out. The difference is the difference between a rotten apple and cider." Wallace leaned on the fence. "And you know this because you read a torn piece of a Yankee newspaper." "I know this because a man who saw it done in Alsace showed me, and because I opened a tin of chopped corn this morning, and it smelled like vinegar, not death." Wallace looked at her. Clara could see him weighing the sentence, trying to decide whether a tin of corn and an old freighter's memory added up to something a widow could bet her herd on. He decided they did not. "I hope you are right," he said. "I truly do, but I think you're going to kill those cattle faster than winter would have." He rode away. Clara stood at the fence and watched him go, and felt the doubt he left behind settle into her stomach like a stone. Wallace was not cruel. Wallace was frightened. His own cattle were short of feed. His own hay was thin, and watching Clara take a gamble he could not understand made him more afraid, not less, because if she was right, it meant he had missed something, and men like Wallace did not enjoy being told they had missed something by a woman holding a sickle. 3 days later, Sykes rode out with 2 men. He did not come to the fence. He rode directly to the staked-out rectangle where Clara had begun to dig and dismounted as if he owned the ground, which, in his mind, he nearly did. "I want to see the collateral," he said. Clara put down the shovel. "The cattle are along the creek." "I can see the cattle. I want to see what you're doing with the rest of my investment." "Your investment is the note. The cattle are mine until I fail to pay." "And what you're doing with those cattle, feeding them dirt and green rot, is damaging property I have a financial interest in." Clara looked at the 2 men Sykes had brought. They were not cowboys. They were clerks from his feed business, brought for the appearance of officialdom. Neither would meet her eyes. "Judd," Clara said, "stand here and do the math with me. I have less than 4 tons of hay. I have 8 sacks of cake. That is not enough to carry 44 head through a mild January, let alone a panhandle winter. My corn will not ripen. I cannot buy hay from you because I cannot pay your price. If I sell cattle now, I lose breeding stock, and the money buys me maybe 3 weeks of feed. You know this. You have done this math. You are counting on this math." Sykes said nothing. "So tell me," Clara said, "if I do nothing, what happens?" "The winter decides." "And if the winter decides wrong, you buy my lease, my cattle, and my water for the cost of an unpaid note. That is what you want. That is what the notice is for. You are not here to protect your investment. You are here to watch it fail." Sykes looked at the chopped green stalks piled beside the trench line. "Burying wet corn in the dirt is not ranching," he said. "It is not farming. It is the kind of thing a woman does when she has no man left to tell her it is foolish." He mounted and rode away. The 2 clerks followed without speaking. Clara picked up the shovel. Her hands were already blistered from 3 days of digging, and the trench was only 2 feet deep at the shallow end. She had 36 more feet to go and 8 feet down, and she had to cut and chop 9 acres of corn and fill and pack and seal the trench before frost. And she had 1 old mule and 2 horses and a Frenchman who had promised her until October. She drove the shovel into the ground and felt the jar travel up her arms and into her shoulders. The earth here was clay and caliche, hard enough to ring when the blade hit it. Every shovelful weighed more than the last, but she dug. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who could not understand what you were building? Construction began in earnest on the 2nd Monday of September. Baptiste arrived before dawn with a length of rope, a carpenter's square he had borrowed from a freighter in Moby T, and a glass bottle filled with muddy water. Clara had spent the previous 3 days digging the shallow end of the trench alone, and the hole looked more like a grave than a silo. Baptiste stood at the edge and studied it. "The site is wrong," he said. Clara felt something collapse inside her chest. "What do you mean wrong?" "The ground dips here." He pointed to the east end. "What follows the low ground? After a rain, this trench will collect seepage from the rise, and the bottom will flood. Wet bottom means the feed sits in water. Water below and air above is the worst combination. The bottom must drain away from the mass, or you lose everything underneath." He uncorked the bottle of muddy water and poured it on the ground near the stakes. They watched it run. The water moved east, toward the low spot Clara had chosen because the earth was softer there. "Move it here," Baptiste said, and he walked 20 feet uphill to a slight rise near the shed. The ground was harder. The clay was denser. But water poured there ran away in 3 directions. Harder to dig, better to keep. Clara looked at the 3 days of work she had already done in the wrong place. She closed her eyes. She opened them. She pulled the stakes. They marked the new trench that morning, 38 feet long, 14 feet wide at the top, tapering to 8 feet at the bottom, 8 feet deep. Baptiste explained the taper, sloped walls pressed inward on the packed mass, adding weight that squeezed out air. Straight walls pulled away from the feed as the pile settled, creating gaps at the edges. The dimensions were not guesses. Baptiste had calculated the volume based on what he remembered from his father's dairy and from an agricultural paper he had read on a freight run to Kansas City. At roughly 40 pounds of packed corn per cubic foot, the trench would hold between 50 and 60 tons of silage. Clara's 44 cattle needed 28 to 32 pounds per animal per day, more for the large cows, less for yearlings. If the winter ran 60 days of hard feeding, she needed roughly 70,000 pounds. The trench, if she could fill it, would hold more than enough. The problem was not the math. The problem was the labor. Clara dug before sunrise. The clay rang against the shovel blade like a dull bell. She dug in layers, shaving the walls to the taper Baptiste had marked with string and stakes. When the shovel hit caliche, she used a pick that had belonged to Ellis and that raised blisters on top of blisters until her palms looked like something that had been boiled. She cut corn through the middle of the day when the heat made digging impossible. The sickle was dull, and she had no grindstone, so she hammered the edge against a flat rock the way Baptiste showed her, which restored enough bite to cut, but not enough to make the work anything less than exhausting. Each stalk had to be cut at the base, dragged to the chopping area, and cut into thumb-length pieces by hand. Baptiste rigged a crude feed cutter from a plank, a hinge, and a heavy blade salvaged from a broken hay knife, and the cutter doubled Clara's speed, but doubled was still slow. At dusk, she hauled the chopped corn to the trench in canvas bundles dragged by the mule. The mule's shoulder worsened daily. By the end of the first week, the animal could not pull a full load uphill, and Clara began making 2 trips where one should have been enough. Baptiste worked beside her every day. He was 62 and moved like it, but he did not stop. He dug when Clara cut. He cut when Clara hauled. He sharpened blades, adjusted the cutter, checked the trench walls for cracks, and taught through action rather than lecture. One evening, as they sat outside the dugout eating cold biscuits and salt pork, Clara asked him about Strasbourg. "Not Strasbourg," he said. "Outside, a valley. The farm was small, 20 cows, which was enough if you did not want to be rich, and my father did not want to be rich. He wanted to be correct. Everything had to be done the right way. The trench had to be straight. The corn had to be cut at the right week. The packing had to be tight enough that he could not push a knife blade between the layers." "What happened to the farm?" "My mother died. My father sold the cows. I came to New Orleans and moved freight because freight does not die and does not need to be fed in winter." He said this without self-pity, the way a man describes weather. "But you remember the trench," Clara said. "I remember everything about the trench. I remember the sound the corn made when the horses walked on it. I remember the smell when my father opened it in February, and the steam came up and the cows pushed against the fence to get to it. I remember thinking that my father had buried summer in the ground and dug it up again in winter." Clara looked at the half-dug trench in the last light. "That is what Wallace said I was doing, burying summer." "Wallace is right about the action. He's wrong about the result." The first week ended with 12 feet of trench dug to depth and 3 rows of corn cut, chopped, and piled under canvas. The work was behind schedule. Clara calculated that she needed to dig another 26 feet, cut the remaining 6 acres, and begin filling within 2 weeks to have any chance of sealing the trench before the first hard frost. Then the weather turned. A blue norther dropped out of the northwest on the 15th of September, early enough to be unusual and cold enough to silver the grass. The temperature fell 30 degrees between noon and midnight. Clara woke to find ice on the water bucket inside the dugout and frost on the corn leaves nearest the creek. She ran to the field in her night clothes. The stalks were stiff and white at the tips. She broke one and pressed the ear, still soft, still green inside. The frost had burned the outer leaves but had not killed the stalk. She had days, not weeks. If another norther came, the corn would freeze solid, and frozen corn could not be chopped, packed, or fermented. It would be dead weight in a dead field. Baptiste found her standing in the frosted corn with bare feet and told her to put on boots before she lost toes. Then he said the things she already knew. We cut everything, now, today. All of it. We pile it and chop it and cover it, and we fill the trench as we dig it. No more waiting for the hole to be finished. The race began. Clara cut. Baptiste chopped. The mule dragged what it could. The horses carried loads in slings that Baptiste rigged from canvas and rope. Clara's palms bled through the rags she wrapped around them. She slept 4 hours a night and 8 standing up. Baptiste coughed in the mornings, but did not stop. On the third day of the race, Wallace Kerr rode to the fence and watched them work. He sat his horse for 10 minutes without speaking. Then he rode home, came back with his older boy, a 14-year-old named Thomas, and a team of 2 horses. I do not believe in your trench, Wallace said, but I believe you will kill yourself filling it, and I do not want to explain to your cattle why they have no one to feed them. He and Thomas worked one afternoon. They dug 4 feet of trench and hauled 6 loads of chopped corn. When they left, Wallace did not say he would return, but Thomas came back the next morning alone, before his father was awake, and dug until noon. The trench grew. 18 feet, 22, 26. The walls held in the dense clay. Clara filled as she dug, packing chopped corn into the completed end, while Baptiste supervised the layering. Each layer was no more than 6 inches deep before it was trampled. Baptiste led the horses back and forth across the green mass until it compressed and juice seeped from the edges. Clara worked the corners with a fence post, ramming the stalks against the tapered walls until her shoulders burned and the post came up slick with corn juice. Baptiste taught her to judge moisture by squeezing. A handful of chopped corn, pressed in the fist, should weep a few drops. If it ran freely, the corn was too wet and would seep acid that could sour the earth beneath the trench. If no moisture appeared, the corn was too dry and would not ferment. Clara learned to feel the difference in her hands, the way her father had felt the difference between brine that was strong enough and brine that would let the cabbage spoil. Salt, Baptiste said one evening. He sprinkled a thin line of salt across a fresh layer. Not enough to taste, enough to slow the wrong kind of souring. My father used a handful per layer. More than that, and the cattle will not eat it. Less than that, and you trust the packing alone. Can I trust the packing alone? If the packing is perfect. My father did not trust perfection. He trusted salt and weight together. The trench was not yet full. The corn was not yet all cut. But the clock had started, and Clara could hear it in every gust of wind from the north. The last week of September became a blur of dirt, corn juice, and pain. Clara lost count of the days by their names and began counting them by what had been accomplished. The day they reached 30 feet, the day the mule refused to pull, and Clara dragged the canvas sling herself for 6 loads until Baptiste took the rope from her hands and tied it to his own horse. The day she split the pick handle on a shelf of caliche and spent an hour binding it with wire while the corn she had cut that morning wilted in the sun. Her body changed. The softness at her waist and arms disappeared. Her hands thickened into tools. She could feel the calluses hardening over the blisters, layer on layer, and she thought of the trench walls. each stratum of pain packed over the last until the surface was tough enough to hold. Her shoulders ached in a way that woke her at night, and when she rose in the dark to check the corn piles, she moved like a woman twice her age, bent at the middle, arms hanging. Baptiste noticed. He did not say anything about her body. He said something about the work. "You are swinging the chopper with your arms," he told her on the morning she nearly dropped the blade into her own foot. "Use your hips. The arms guide. The hips drive. You will last twice as long." She adjusted. He was right. The difference was immediate, and she resented him for not telling her a week earlier, and then she forgave him because he was 62 years old and coughing into his sleeve every morning and still showing up before dawn. The trench reached its full length of 38 feet on the 29th of September. The bottom was uneven in places where caliche shelves had forced Clara to angle the cut, but Baptiste walked the floor and declared it sound. The taper held. The walls leaned inward at the angle he had marked. The drainage ran to the west end, away from the prevailing wind so that any seepage would flow out rather than pooling under the packed mass. Now the filling accelerated. They developed a rhythm. Clara cut and chopped from first light until the heat peaked. Baptiste loaded the slings and drove the horses to the trench. Clara followed with the mule when the mule would cooperate, or with her own back when it would not. At the trench, they spread each load in a layer no thicker than Baptiste's boot sole. Then the horses walked, back and forth, hooves pressing the green mass until it compressed and darkened with moisture. Clara worked the edges with the fence post, driving the chopped stalks against the clay walls, feeling for gaps the way a mason feels for voids in mortar. Baptiste salted each layer with a measured handful from a sack Clara had bought in Mobidi with money she could not afford to spend. 7 cents a pound for coarse salt, and she needed 30 pounds, and the arithmetic of that purchase meant she ate less that week, so the cattle might eat more that winter. The filling was not smooth. On the second day of October, a wind from the south brought heat and humidity that made the chopped corn steam in the piles. Baptiste tested a handful and shook his head. "Too wet. The surface is sweating. If we pack it like this, the bottom layers will seep, and the acid will sour the earth." "What do we do?" "We wait. Spread the piles thin. Let the wind take the surface moisture. Pack tomorrow." "We do not have tomorrow. We do not have an hour we can spare." "You do not have a choice. Pack it too wet, and the whole trench becomes soup by December. The cows will not eat it. It will smell like a swamp, not like feed." Clara spread the piles. They lost a day. She lay in the dugout that night listening to the wind and calculating what one lost day meant against the number of rows still standing. The answer was that she would run out of time before she ran out of corn. She solved it by cutting through the night. Baptiste told her not to. She did it anyway. She hung a lantern from a post at the edge of the field and cut by its light, the sickle throwing shadows that made the corn rows look like ranks of soldiers falling under her blade. The stalks were cool and damp with dew, which was wrong for packing, but meant the chopped pieces did not wilt before morning. She stacked them in rows and let the dawn wind dry the surfaces while she slept for 2 hours on the dugout floor. Amos Rudd returned on the 4th of October. He rode in from the north this time, which meant he had been checking the range above Sweetwater Creek, and the expression on his face confirmed what every cattleman already suspected. The grass was gone. Not thin, not short, gone. The big herds had grazed the open range to bare dirt for miles, and the cattle were beginning to drift, which meant they were beginning to move south ahead of weather that had not arrived yet, but that the animals could sense the way they sensed water and predators, and the particular quality of wind that preceded a norther. Rudd stopped at the fence and looked at the trench. It was 2/3 full. The packed green mass rose 5 feet above the floor, dark and dense, pressed flat by hooves and weight. The smell rising from it was sharp, but not foul, the tang of fermentation, vinegar, and corn sugar, the smell Clara had come to associate with the word working. "What is that?" Rudd said. "Feed," Clara said. Rudd dismounted. He walked to the edge of the trench and looked down at the packed surface. He touched it with his boot. The mass was firm, slightly springy, warm from the fermentation happening inside it. "This is wet corn," he said. "It is corn that is souring the way cabbage sours. It is sealed from air. The acid preserves it. Cattle will eat it." Rudd looked at her the way he might look at a horse that had learned to open its own gate, not with admiration, with suspicion. Things that should not work made Amos Rudd uncomfortable because his entire career had been built on knowing what worked and dismissing what did not. "Who told you this?" he said. "A man who saw it done in Europe, and a torn page from a farm paper. And the corn itself, when I packed it in a tin, and it came out smelling like cider instead of rot." "A tin," Rudd repeated. "A tin. Then a test barrel. Now this." Rudd looked at the trench for a long time. "Cattle eat grass," he said. "They eat hay. They eat cake. They do not eat dirt and sour corn. They will eat what keeps them alive, if it keeps them alive. And if it does not, you will have buried your corn, spent your salt, broken your mule, and arrived at January with nothing. January is coming whether I have something or not." Rudd put his hat back on. "I've seen a lot of people try new things on this range," he said. "I've buried most of them." He mounted and rode north without looking back. Clara watched him go and felt the doubt he left behind mix with the doubt that was already there, the doubt that lived in her stomach and climbed into her throat every time she looked at the trench and wondered whether she was building a pantry or a monument to her own foolishness. She picked up the fence post and went back to packing corners. The final filling took 4 days. Clara cut the last 6 rows of corn on the 7th of October, 3 days before the date Baptiste had set as the latest safe seal. The stalks went into the trench in layers, trampled, salted, and rammed at the edges. The mass rose to within 18 inches of the rim. Baptiste taught her the last critical skill on the morning of the seal. He stood at the west end of the trench, where they would open it in winter, and made Clara study the face. "When you open this in January," he said, "you cut straight down, a clean face. You take what you need for the day. You cover the face with canvas and planks. You do not tear the whole top off. You do not dig a hole in the middle. Every inch of exposed surface is an inch where air returns and rot begins. You feed from one end. You move the face forward. The rest stays sealed. How much spoilage on the face? An inch, maybe 2. You scrape it off. The cattle will not eat the dark layer. Underneath, the feed will be yellow-green and warm. If you see white mold, the seal above that section has cracked. Cut it out. Do not feed white mold. And if the whole thing is white mold?" Baptiste did not answer immediately. He looked at the trench. "Then the seal failed and you have 50 tons of poison, but the seal will not fail if we do the cap right." The cap was the last and most critical construction. They laid plank scraps across the top of the packed corn. Pieces of broken wagon bed, half a door from the shed. Boards Baptiste had scavenged from an abandoned line shack on his freight route. Over the planks, they spread dry prairie grass in a thick mat. Over the grass, Baptiste shoveled wet clay, working it into the seams the way a plasterer works mortar, sealing every crack where air might enter. Then the earth, 3 feet of it. Clara shoveled until she could not lift her arms, and then she shoveled more. Baptiste worked the other end. The mule dragged loads of dirt from the spoil pile they had created during the digging. When the mound was complete, it rose above the surrounding ground like a low, flat-topped hill, like something that had always been there, like a grave large enough for something that had not yet died. Clara stood beside it in the last light of October 7th. Her hands were raw. Her shoulders could not rise above her ears. She had lost weight she did not have to lose, and her dress hung on her frame like laundry on a line. The trench was sealed. Inside it, 50 tons of green corn was beginning to sour in the dark, bacteria eating sugar, producing acid, dropping the temperature of rot below the threshold where spoilage could take hold. Or not. She would not know until she opened it. Baptiste put his hand on the mound. "It is tight," he said. "I can feel it settling. That's good. The mass is compressing. The air is leaving." Clara put her hand beside his. The earth was faintly warm. "How long before we know?" she said. "You will know when you open it. Not before." The weeks that followed were the hardest kind of waiting, the kind where there is nothing to do but watch for failure. Clara checked the mound every morning. She walked its length, looking for cracks in the clay cap. After a windstorm on the 12th of October, a hairline fissure appeared near the east end. She mixed clay and grass into a paste and sealed it before the sun moved a hand's width across the sky. Baptiste showed her how to test for leaks by holding a lit match near the surface. If the flame flickered toward the mound, air was being drawn in. If it flickered away or held steady, the seal was intact. The match held steady. She checked for smell. Baptiste had taught her to crouch near the base and breathe. Good fermentation smelled sharp and sour, like vinegar with a sweetness underneath. Bad fermentation smelled of death, the heavy, cloying stink of putrefaction. Every morning, Clara crouched and breathed and waited for the smell that would tell her she had failed. Every morning, the smell was sharp and clean, but she could not open the trench to confirm. Opening before winter need would expose the face to air and begin the spoilage clock. The trench had to remain sealed until the cattle truly needed it, and the cattle did not need it yet because they were still finding enough in the picked-over grass and the thin hay and the cottonseed cake to stay standing. Barely. The cows licked at fence posts and chewed at bark. The yearlings stood with their heads low. The late calves nursed from mothers whose udders were beginning to shrink. The grass disappeared. Not slowly, the way grass thins in autumn, but completely, the way a plate is cleaned. Every cow in the panhandle was eating the same ground, and the ground gave out. Clara could stand on the rise beside the trench and look in any direction and see dirt. Brown dirt, cracked dirt, dirt that had been grass in June and was now just the memory of grass pressed flat by a million hooves. Wallace Kerr rode over in late October. His haystack, which had looked adequate in September, was shrinking faster than he had planned because his cattle were eating more hay than usual to compensate for the missing grass. He had calculated his supply to last through February. Now he thought it would run out in January. "How much have you got left?" Clara asked. "Maybe 3 tons, maybe less. The mice are in the bottom bales, and the bales are not as heavy as I thought. I should have weighed them." "And your cake?" "Gone by Christmas." Clara could see the fear in Wallace's face. It was not the abstract fear of a man who reads about weather in a newspaper. It was the specific fear of a man who has counted his feed and counted his cattle and knows the numbers do not meet. "You could sell some head now," Clara said. "The market is still. The market is dead. Everyone is selling. You cannot give cattle away. Sykes offered me $1.50 a head for my yearlings. $1.50. That is not a price. That is theft with a receipt." Sykes. Always Sykes. The name moved through every conversation like a cold draft through a house. Sykes buying low, Sykes selling high, Sykes holding notes and waiting for the weather to collect them. Amos Rudd came through again in November. He had been riding the range north of the Canadian River, and what he had seen had aged him. Cattle were already drifting. The big herds were moving south ahead of weather, and the drift fences, the miles of wire that ranchers had strung across the open range to keep their cattle from mixing, had become walls. Cattle pressed against the wire, unable to move south, piling up in draws and creek bottoms where the wind cut and the temperature dropped, and there was nothing to eat. "It is going to be bad," Rudd told Clara. He said it standing beside her trench mound, and for the first time, he did not look at the mound with contempt. He looked at it with something closer to curiosity. "How bad?" Clara asked. "The worst I have seen. Maybe the worst anyone has seen. The grass is gone from here to Kansas. The big outfits do not have enough hay. Nobody has enough hay. The only people who might come through are the ones who find a way to feed that nobody else thought of." He looked at the mound again. "You believe this will work?" "I believe it has to work." "That is not the same thing." "No," Clara said, "but it is what I have." Rudd left without offering help, but he also left without dismissing her. That was new. Baptiste coughed blood into a rag on the morning of November the 15th. Clara saw it. He folded the rag and pushed it into his pocket, but the stain was bright against the cloth, and the sound of the cough was different now, deeper, wetter, the kind of cough that comes from a place in the chest where air and fluid are meeting in ways they should not. "How long?" Clara asked. "The cough?" "Since summer. It comes and goes." "That was not a cough that comes and goes." Baptiste looked at her with the mild irritation of a man who does not want to discuss his body. "I have seen cold winters and bad feed and cattle that should have died. I have not died yet." "Baptiste, when the trench is opened and the cattle eat, I will rest. Not before." He would not speak of it again. Clara did not press him, but she watched him now the way she watched the trench mound, for cracks, for signs of something failing that she could not see from the outside. Sykes made his final move before the storm. In December, he bought hay from a ranch south of the Canadian and hauled it to Mobetia, where he stacked it in his yard behind a locked fence. The price he set was 3 times what hay had cost in August. Men who had laughed at Clara's trench now stood in front of Sykes's yard and calculated whether they could afford to keep their cattle alive at $1 a bale. Sykes rode to Clara's place on December the 20th. He did not bring clerks this time. He brought an offer. "Sell me the herd," he said. "All 44 head. I will pay $3 a head and forgive the note. That is $270 in your pocket. You can take the stage east. Start over." $3 a head is robbery, and you know it. $3 a head is what cattle are worth when there's nothing to feed them. Come February, they will be worth less than the cost of dragging the carcasses to a pit. I am doing you a kindness. You are doing yourself a purchase. Sykes leaned forward in his saddle. "That mound of dirt will not save you, Clara. I have asked every man I know, and not one of them has heard of burying green corn and feeding it to cattle. It is not a method. It is a burial. And when the first norther comes and your cattle are starving and your mound is frozen solid, you will wish you had taken my offer." Clara said nothing. Sykes waited. The wind moved between them. He turned his horse and rode toward Mobetia, and Clara stood beside her sealed trench and listened to the hooves fade, and felt the cold settling into the ground beneath her feet. The storm announced itself on January the 8th, 1887, with a sky the color of a bruise. Clara had seen northers before. Every panhandle winter brought them sudden drops in temperature, walls of cold air pushing down from the plains, wind that could strip warmth from a body in minutes. But the sky on the afternoon of January the 8th was different. It was not gray. It was green at the horizon, the color of old copper, and the wind did not gust, it pressed. A steady, increasing pressure from the north, as if the entire atmosphere was being shoved southward by something immense and patient. The cattle knew. They moved to the south fence and stood with their backs to the wind, heads low, shoulders hunched. The calves pressed against their mother's flanks. Clara's two horses stood in the open shed with their ears flat. Baptiste was in the dugout. He had been there for 3 days, his cough bad enough that standing made him dizzy. Clara had brought him broth and blankets, and he lay on the cot with his eyes open, listening to the wind change. "It is coming," he said. "I know." "You should move the cattle to the lee side of the shed. The south fence will not hold if they press it." Clara moved the cattle. It took an hour in the rising wind, and by the time she had them crowded against the shed's south wall, the first snow was falling. Not the soft, slow snow of a normal winter storm. This snow came horizontal, driven by wind that had picked up speed across 200 miles of flat prairie with nothing to slow it down. The flakes were small and hard, more ice than snow, and they stung Clara's face like thrown sand. By midnight, the temperature had dropped below zero. Clara could not read the thermometer on the shed post because the glass had frosted over, but she could feel it. The cold was not an absence of warmth. It was a presence. It occupied space. It pressed through the walls of the dugout and through the blankets and through the clothes she'd piled on top of the blankets. It found the gaps between boards and the cracks around the door and the place where the stovepipe met the roof, and it entered like something that had been waiting outside for permission and had decided to stop asking. The cattle lowed through the night, not the normal sounds of restless animals. Deep, guttural sounds, the sounds of creatures in distress. Clara lay in the dugout listening to them and thinking about the trench 20 feet away, sealed under 3 feet of frozen earth, holding either salvation or nothing. Morning brought a world she did not recognize. The snow was not deep, 8 or 9 inches, but the wind had crusted it into a shell hard enough to walk on. The grass beneath was locked away. The cattle could not paw through the crust to reach it, and even if they could, there was no grass underneath, only the dirt that had been dirt since October. The hay Clara had rationed through December was nearly gone. 3 bales remained, stacked inside the shed. 8 sacks of cottonseed cake sat in the dugout where mice could not reach them, and 2 of those sacks were already open and half empty. She had feed for 3 days, maybe 4 if she had the rations and watched the cattle weaken, or she had the trench. Clara walked to the mound. The earth cap was frozen solid, crusted with snow, hard as stone. She pressed her boot against it and felt nothing give. She would have to chop through 3 feet of frozen earth, then through the clay seal, then through the plank layer to reach whatever was underneath. She had not opened the trench since the day it was sealed 3 months ago. She did not know what was inside. No one knew. The trench was a theory, a memory, a tin of corn that had smelled like cider, and the word of a sick old man who had watched his father do this in a country 4,000 miles away. It was everything Clara had, and it might be nothing. She went to the shed and got the pick. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because what comes out of that frozen earth changes everything. The first swing of the pick bounced off the frozen surface and sent a shock up Clara's arms that made her teeth ring. The earth was not just frozen, it was welded. Dirt and ice and clay fused into something that resisted the pick the way iron resists a file. She swung again. A chip flew. A crack appeared. She worked from the West End where Baptiste had told her to open. The wind was at her back, which meant the exposed face would be sheltered from the worst of the cold. She swung the pick in a rhythm she had learned from digging the trench itself. Aim, drive, pry, clear. Each swing freed a piece the size of her fist. The work was brutal. Her arms, already weakened from months of labor and weeks of reduced food, screamed at every impact. Sweat formed inside her coat and froze when she paused. An hour in. She had cleared a section 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep. The plank layer appeared frozen boards, gray with frost, sitting on top of the grass mat. She pried a board loose with the pick blade and pulled it away. The grass beneath was brown and stiff. She raked it aside. The smell hit her before she saw the feed. It rose from the gap like breath from a living thing. Sharp, sour, warm. Not the dead sweet stink of rot, not the flat nothing of frozen ground. A living smell, tangy and fermented, the smell of vinegar and corn sugar and something yeasty that she recognized from her father's cellar, from the moment when the crock lid came off the sauerkraut and the kitchen filled with the proof that what had been buried was not dead. Clara dropped to her knees beside the trench. She pulled the grass mat away from a wider section. The top layer of corn was blackened, 2 inches of dark, spoiled mass where air had lingered longest before the seal pushed it out. She scraped the black layer away with her hands. Underneath, the corn was yellow-green. It was soft. It was moist. It steamed faintly in the frozen air because the fermentation inside the trench had generated enough warmth to keep the mass above freezing even while the earth above it was locked in ice. She pulled out a handful and held it to her face. It smelled the way Baptiste had said it would, like cider, like bread just beginning to turn, like something that had been alive and had been changed into something else that was still, in its own way, alive. Clara carried the handful to the fence where the cattle stood. 41 animals. She had lost 2 calves in November to weakness and 1 old cow to a fall on ice 3 days ago. The remaining 41 stood with their heads low and their ribs showing through hides that were dull and rough with cold. They watched her approach with the wary stillness of animals that have learned not to expect. She held the feed through the fence. The nearest cow, a 6-year-old brindle that had been Ellis's best milker, stretched her neck and sniffed. Her nostrils flared. She pulled back. Clara waited. The cow came forward again, lips working, and took the handful from Clara's palm. The cow chewed, swallowed, reached for more. The next cow pushed forward, then the next. Within minutes, the cattle were pressing against the fence, necks extended, mouths working, the low sounds in their throats changing from distress to demand. Clara had never heard cattle ask for food with such urgency and such willingness at the same time. They wanted it. Whatever was in her hands, whatever had come out of that dark, frozen trench, the cattle wanted it. She went back and cut a full face. Baptiste had taught her to cut straight down, and she did, using the pick and a flat shovel to carve a vertical wall in the packed mass. The face was 3 feet wide and exposed from top to bottom. She forked the silage into the feed bunk she had built from scrap lumber in November, scraping away the spoiled outer inch and letting the good feed fall in mounds that steamed in the morning light. The cattle ate. They ate with the desperate concentration of animals that have been hungry long enough to forget politeness. They shouldered each other aside. They buried their muzzles in the feed. They chewed with their eyes half closed, and the sound of 41 cattle eating, the grinding of jaws, the wet compression of fermented corn between molars, the rhythmic sway of heads, filled the morning with a sound that Clara realized she had not heard in weeks, the sound of enough. She rationed 28 to 32 pounds per grown cow. smaller portions for the yearlings, cottonseed cake mixed in for the weakest animals. She measured by forkful, counting loads, estimating weight by the heft in her arms. Baptiste had taught her to judge a forkful by how it pulled against the shoulder, and she used that now, standing in the wind, forking feed while the snow blew sideways, and the cattle ate, and the trench gave up what it had held. The storm did not end. It lasted 3 days. The temperature did not rise above zero. The wind did not drop below 20 miles an hour. The snow crusted and recrusted until the ground was armor. Clara fed the cattle twice a day, morning and late afternoon, cutting a fresh face each time and covering the exposed surface with canvas weighted by planks, the way Baptiste had instructed. The spoilage on the recut face was minimal, a thin, dark line that she scraped away before each feeding. On the second day, Wallace Kerr appeared at the fence. He was on foot. His horse had gone lame. His face was red and raw, and his eyes had the look of a man who has run out of options and is trying to calculate which humiliation costs least. "My hay is gone," he said. Clara looked at him. "I have 7 cows left and my milk cow and Thomas's saddle horse. The rest—" He stopped. "The rest are down. Some are dead. Some will be dead by morning." "How much do you need?" "Enough to keep the milk cow alive. Thomas needs the milk. My wife." He stopped again. Clara forked 2 loads of silage into a canvas sack and handed it through the fence. "Keep it covered," she said. "Feed it fast. Do not leave the face exposed. If you have a barrel, pack what you do not use and weight the lid." Wallace took the sack. He stood holding it in both arms, and Clara could see him smelling it, the sharp vinegar tang, and she could see the confusion in his face. He had told her it would rot. He had told her it would founder cows. He had told her wet corn in the ground was foolishness spoken sideways. "Thank you," he said. "Do not thank me. Feed your cow." He walked away through the snow with the sack against his chest, and Clara watched him until the white closed around him, and he was gone. The third day brought the worst. Wind gusts strong enough to rip the canvas off the trench face. Clara spent 2 hours in the dark, repinning the canvas while her fingers went numb and her breath froze on her collar. A yearling broke through the south fence and wandered into the open, and Clara spent another hour tracking it through knee-deep drifts and driving it back. By the time she returned, 2 more cattle had gone down. She checked them. One was a late calf, too small and too thin to survive the cold. It was dead when she reached it, its eyes frosted open, its body already stiffening. The other was an old cow, the oldest in the herd, who had lain down in the lee of the shed and could not rise. Clara gave her feed by hand, pressing forkfuls of silage against the cow's lips until the animal chewed. The cow ate. She drank water Clara hauled from the well in a bucket that froze at the rim before she could pour it. But she did not stand. By morning, the cow was dead. 3 dead. 41 alive. Clara stood beside the trench on the morning of January the 12th and counted. The herd stood along the feed bunk, eating. They were thin. Their hides were rough. Their breath made clouds that the wind tore apart. But they were standing. They were eating. They were alive. The world around them was not. Clara could see from the rise above the trench 3 carcasses along the road south, range cattle that had drifted against a fence and died there, pressed against wire, their bodies half buried in drifted snow. Farther south, where the LX range began, the losses would be worse. Thousands of cattle trapped by drift fences, piled in draws, frozen standing. Amos Rudd would find them when the thaw came. Everyone would find them. But Clara's cattle were eating. Baptiste lay in the dugout, too weak to stand for more than a few minutes. Clara brought him broth and a plate of beans and a cup of coffee that she heated on the stove. He asked about the face quality. She described it: yellow-green, firm, steaming slightly, the spoiled layer no more than an inch thick. The acid is holding, he said. The pH dropped fast enough. If it had not, the whole mass would be soft and brown by now. The cattle eat it like they're angry at it. Hungry cattle eat anything, but they will eat good silage with preference. Watch their rumen. If the bellies fill and stay round through the afternoon, the feed is digesting. If the bellies swell and the cows stop chewing cud, there's a problem. Clara watched. The bellies filled. The cows chewed cud. The feed digested. She went back to the dugout that evening and sat beside Baptiste's cot. The wind had finally dropped. The stars were out. The temperature was still brutal, but the storm had broken, and the silence that replaced the wind was so complete that Clara could hear the cattle chewing 50 feet away. "It worked," she said. Baptiste looked at the ceiling. "It worked," he said. "And you did it. Not me. Not my father. You." Clara said nothing. She sat in the quiet dugout and listened to the cattle eat and felt something she had not felt since Ellis died. Not safety, not certainty. Something simpler and harder to name. The feeling that the ground beneath her would hold. The storm broke on the 13th of January, and what it left behind was a country that looked like something after a war. Clara stood on the rise above the trench on the morning of the 14th and counted her herd for the third time because the number seemed wrong, too high, too generous for what she had just lived through. 41 head, 32 cows, 5 yearlings, 4 calves, 3 animals lost, 2 calves, and the old cow. 7%. She said the number aloud because saying it made it real, and because the number she could see from the same rise, looking beyond her fence to the open range, was something that made 7% feel like a miracle. Carcasses lined the drift fences to the north. Clara could not count them from where she stood, but she could see the dark shapes against the snow, pressed together at the wire, bodies that had been living animals a week ago and were now landmarks of failure. The LX range, which ran 10,000 head, would find its losses in the hundreds. Some of the smaller outfits along Sweetwater Creek had lost everything. Wallace Kerr came on the 15th. He walked because both his horses were lame. He brought Thomas, who carried an empty sack. "I lost 19 head," Wallace said. He said it the way a man reads a list. Flat, controlled, the emotion pressed down under the words where it could not interfere with the business of asking for help. "The milk cow is alive because of your feed. Thomas is alive because of the milk cow." Clara gave him 4 forkfuls of silage in the sack. She showed him the face of the trench, the clean vertical cut, the thin line of spoilage at the outer inch, the yellow-green interior that steamed faintly in the cold air. Wallace knelt beside the trench and pressed his hand against the face. He smelled his fingers. "It is warm," he said. "The fermentation keeps it above freezing inside the mass. The colder it is outside, the more the warmth shows. And the cattle eat it. Look at them." Wallace looked. Clara's cattle stood along the feed bunk, chewing cud, their bellies round and their eyes clear. They were thin, but they were functional. They were animals that would breed in spring, that would calve, that would rebuild. Wallace's surviving cattle, by contrast, were gaunt and dull-eyed, standing on hay scraps, and the last of his cottonseed cake alive but diminished. "I told you it would rot," Wallace said. "You did. I told you wet corn in the ground was foolishness. You did." Wallace stood up. He looked at the trench, at the cattle, at Clara. "I was wrong," he said. "Tell me how to build one." Clara did not make him wait. She walked him through the trench that afternoon. The dimensions, the taper, the drainage, the chopping length, the layering, the packing, the salting, the cap. She used the trench itself as the lesson, pointing to each element while Wallace and Thomas listened with the intensity of men who have learned the cost of not listening. The edges are the weakness, Clara said. She showed Wallace the seam where corn met clay wall. Air enters here first. You pack the edges harder than the center. Use a post. Ram it until your shoulders burn. If you can push a finger between the corn and the wall, you have not packed enough. How much salt? A handful per layer, not more. Too much salt and the cattle refuse it. Too little and you rely on the packing alone. Can you rely on the packing alone? Maybe, but I would not bet my herd on maybe. Thomas asked the question his father would not. How did you know this would work? Clara looked at the boy. He was 14, with his father's nervous eyes and his mother's chin, and he had come to dig her trench without being asked. I did not know, she said. A man who saw it done in Europe told me the principle. A torn page from a farm paper told me others had tried it. A tin of chopped corn told me the science worked at small scale. After that, I had to trust the trench. And if it had not worked? Then Judd Sykes would own this place, and I would be on a stage east with nothing. Wallace took the sack of silage and his son and walked home. Clara watched them cross the flat and thought about the word wrong. Wallace had said it plainly, without apology and without defense. He had been wrong, and he had said so, and now he wanted to learn. That was the best kind of conversion, the kind that came from need, not sentiment. Amos Rudd arrived 2 days later, and his arrival was different from every visit before it. He dismounted. In 4 months of visits, Rudd had never once gotten off his horse at Clara's place. He had delivered his assessments from the saddle, looking down, the posture of a man who expected to leave quickly because the situation below him was not worth the effort of standing on the same ground. Now he dismounted, tied his horse to the fence, and walked to the trench without waiting for Clara to come out. Clara found him standing at the open face, his hat in his hand, looking at the packed yellow-green mass the way a man looks at something he has to revise his understanding of the world to accommodate. Rudd, Clara said. I want to see it, he said. All of it. How you built it, how you fill it, how you feed from it. I want to understand what I'm looking at. Clara walked him through everything. She showed him the taper of the walls. She showed him the drainage line. She explained the cutting, the chopping, the layering, the trampling, the salting, the cap. She pulled a forkful from the face and let him smell it. She showed him the spoiled outer layer and the good interior beneath. She pointed to the cattle. 32 cows, 5 yearlings, 4 calves, she said. I lost 3 during the storm, 2 calves too small to hold warmth, and 1 old cow that went down and could not rise. 3, Rudd repeated. 3. Rudd looked at the range beyond the fence. He did not need to say the number. Clara knew it. Everyone knew it. Losses along Sweetwater Creek were running between 40 and 75%. The LX outfit had lost cattle in numbers no one had finished counting. The drift fences had become death traps, and the animals that had not been trapped had starved on open range where the grass had been gone since October. I called it a grave, Rudd said. He was not looking at Clara. He was looking at the trench. The day I rode out here and saw you packing wet corn in the dirt, I said cattle eat grass, hay, and cake, and dirt is for graves. I remember. It was a pantry. He put his hat back on. I'm going to tell my men what I saw here. I'm going to tell them to plant corn this spring and build trenches in the fall. Some of them will listen, some of them will not, but I will tell them. He turned to Clara. What do you need? I need Sykes off my back. Sykes holds your note. Sykes holds a note for $138 on a herd that survived a winter that killed half the cattle in Wheeler County. The note is the same. The collateral is worth more than he thought. Rudd nodded slowly. I will talk to Sykes. Do not talk to Sykes on my behalf. Talk to Sykes where other men can hear. Let him explain why a debt on a living herd is worth less than a debt on a dead one. Rudd looked at her for a long moment. Then something happened that Clara had not seen before and would not see again. Amos Rudd smiled. It was a small smile, barely a movement, but it was there. You would have made a decent trail, boss, he said. I would have made a better one than decent. He mounted and rode north, and Clara stood beside her trench and felt the wind against her face and the cold in her fingers and the weight of what she had done settling into her bones, like the warmth the cattle must feel when they ate silage that had been summer corn and was now winter feed. The community came to Clara in pieces, one at a time, then two, then groups. A rancher named Driscoll, who ran 30 head 6 miles east, rode over with his son-in-law and asked to see the trench. Clara showed them. Driscoll had lost 22 cattle. His son-in-law had lost all but 3. They asked the questions everyone asked. How deep? How wide? How wet? How long to fill? How much salt? How many cattle would it feed? Clara answered with numbers. She had learned that numbers were the language men trusted, and she gave them numbers they could use. A woman named Prentice, a ranch wife from north of Mobeetie, appeared one morning without her husband. She had heard about Clara's trench from Wallace's wife, and she wanted to see it for herself because her husband refused to come and she was tired of burying calves. My husband says wet corn is poison, Mrs. Prentice said. Your husband's cattle are dead, Clara said. Mine are eating. Mrs. Prentice looked at the trench, at the cattle, at Clara. Will you show me how? I will show anyone who brings a shovel and is willing to listen. Sykes reacted the way a man reacts when the ground shifts under a building he owns. Clara's trench was not just a threat to his feed monopoly, it was a threat to the system that made the monopoly possible, the system in which winter was unpredictable, feed was scarce, and the man who controlled the supply controlled the price and the people who needed it. He came to Mobeetie's store and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. Sour corn is not feed, he said. It is compost. She is feeding her cattle garbage, and when those cattle drop dead from acidosis in February, every fool who followed her will be standing in my yard begging for hay. Pruitt, the storekeeper, said nothing, but 3 men in the store had seen Clara's cattle, and one of them, Driscoll, turned and said, Her cattle are standing, mine are not. I will take her garbage over your hay. Sykes left the store. He did not slam the door. He closed it carefully, the way a man closes something he does not intend to open again on the same terms. That evening, Sykes rode to Clara's place. He did not dismount. He did not look at the trench. He looked at Clara. You're feeding sour poison, he said, and when the first cow dies, it will be on your conscience, not mine. Bring a veterinarian, Clara said. Any veterinarian. Let him look at my herd and look at the herds you sold hay to, and let him say which cattle are healthier. There is no veterinarian in Mobeetie. Then bring Amos Rudd. He has inspected my trench and my cattle. He will tell you what he told me. Sykes rode away. Clara watched him go and understood that what she was seeing was not anger. It was fear. Sykes was afraid because the structure he had built, the feed monopoly, the notes, the leverage of winter scarcity, required other people to fail. Clara had not failed, and the method she used was one anyone with corn and a shovel could replicate. If it spread, his power contracted. Every trench dug was a customer lost. Baptiste improved slightly in late January. The cold eased enough that he could sit outside the dugout in the afternoon sun, wrapped in blankets, watching Clara manage the feed out. He corrected her once. She had left the face uncovered for too long while loading the bunk, and the outer inch had begun to darken from air exposure. And then he stopped correcting her. She did not need correction. She had internalized the rhythm of the trench. Cut the face, scrape the spoilage, fork the feed, cover the face, weight the canvas. One afternoon, as Clara brought him coffee, he told her about the farm outside Strasbourg in more detail than he had shared before. His father had been a careful man, precise in his measurements and his hatreds. He hated waste the way some men hated debt, as a moral failing that could be measured and punished. The trench had been his father's answer to the waste of good forage that rotted in the field every autumn because there was more than the cattle could eat fresh. He kept a ledger, Baptiste said. Every trench, the date he cut, the date he filled, the weather, how many loads, how much salt. He measured the spoilage when he opened it and wrote the number down. He measured the milk yield and wrote that down. He believed that anything worth doing was worth measuring, and anything not worth measuring was not worth doing. You sound like you disagreed. I disagreed with everything my father did until I was old enough to understand that disagreeing with a careful man does not make you right. It makes you careless. You are not careless. I was careless for 30 years. I left the farm. I left the dairy. I moved freight because freight does not need to be measured with the same attention. You load it, you move it, you unload it. I was good at moving things and bad at staying in one place. He coughed. It was the wet cough, and Clara saw him press the rag to his mouth. Now I am in one place, and the thing I carried from that farm, the thing I thought I had left behind, turns out to be the most useful thing I own. Clara sat beside him. Tell me about the milk yield. Did it change when the cows ate silage? It held. In winter, when hay-fed cows gave less milk, the silage-fed cows held their yield. My father said the moisture in the silage kept the rumen active. I do not know if that is the right explanation, but the milk was there. I have no dairy cows. You have breeding cows. A cow that holds condition through winter breeds earlier in spring. A cow that breeds earlier calves earlier. An early calf has more grass. More grass means more weight. More weight means more value. He looked at her. You are not just saving cattle through winter. You are changing the mathematics of the year. Clara turned this over in her mind. The trench was not just emergency feed. It was a system. Plant, cut, pack, seal, feed, breed, repeat. A cycle that could be maintained and improved year after year, the way her father had maintained the sauerkraut crock and the smokehouse and the root cellar. Not as isolated acts of preservation, but as an integrated practice of keeping. This was the moment when Clara understood that she had not merely survived. She had learned something that could be taught, replicated, and built upon. The trench was not her secret, it was her method. She and Baptiste clashed once, and the clash mattered. In early February, as the feed supply in the trench began to diminish, Clara proposed opening the second end to speed the feed out. Baptiste refused. You open one end, he said. His voice was firm, the way it got when she pressed against something he considered settled. You move the face forward. You do not open two ends. Two open faces means twice the spoilage. You will lose more feed to air than you save in convenience. The cattle need more. I am feeding 41 head, plus what I give Wallace, and the face is only 3 feet wide. I spend half my morning forking feed from a narrow cut. Widen the face. Do not open the other end. Widening the face exposes more surface area to air, less than opening a second face. You are trading one large problem for two smaller problems that are together larger than the one you started with. Clara stared at him. You are telling me I am wrong. I am telling you that the trench is smarter than your impatience. They did not speak for the rest of the afternoon. Clara fed the cattle from the single face, forking silage through the narrow cut, her arms aching, her frustration visible in the way she drove the fork into the mass. That evening she sat outside and did the math. Baptiste was right. 2 open faces at 3 feet wide each meant 6 feet of surface exposed to air. One face widened to 4.5 feet was more surface than the original 3, but less than 6. She could move more feed with one wider cut than with 2 narrow ones, and the spoilage would be less. She told Baptiste the next morning. I know, he said. You are stubborn, not stupid. The relationship between them had changed. It was no longer teacher and student. It was 2 people who understood the same thing from different directions. Baptiste from memory and observation, Clara from practice and necessity, and who trusted each other enough to argue and enough to listen. When Baptiste was too sick to walk to the trench, Clara described the face condition to him, and he diagnosed from description. When Clara developed a technique for scraping the spoiled layer with a flat board instead of her hands, Baptiste acknowledged it as better than his father's method without resentment. They were partners, unequal because Baptiste was dying and they both knew it. But partners. Spring came late and ugly. March brought mud deep enough to swallow a boot. The snow melted, and what it revealed was a country littered with death. Carcasses along every fence line, bones in every draw. The smell of rot rising with the temperature as thousands of cattle that had frozen in January thawed in March and began to decompose. The count was staggering. Clara heard the numbers as they filtered through Mobiti. The LX had lost over 1,000 head. A ranch south of the Canadian had lost its entire herd. Wallace Kerr had lost 19 of 31 cattle. Driscoll had lost 22. A rancher named McMurtry, who had run 600 head on open range, had found fewer than 100 alive. Along the drift fences, the carcasses were piled so deep that in places a person could walk on them. Clara had lost 3. The number followed her through town like a sound that other people could hear. She went to Pruitt's store for salt and flour and sugar, and men who had not spoken to her since Ellis's funeral stepped aside to let her pass. Not out of respect exactly, out of something closer to unease. She had done something they had not thought possible, and they were still calculating what it meant. Baptiste did not see spring. He died on the morning of April the 2nd, 1887, in the cot in Clara's dugout, with a cup of coffee cooling on the stool beside him and his right hand resting on a folded page from an agricultural paper that Clara had found in Pruitt's store and brought him a week earlier. The page described the Ensilage trials at a state agricultural college in Massachusetts. He had read it twice, and then folded it and kept it under his hand as if it were a letter from someone he had known. Clara found him when she brought breakfast. His face was still. His chest did not move. The light through the dugout window lay across his hands, and she could see the veins and the calluses and the nails that were cracked from months of work he had not been strong enough to do, but had done anyway. She sat beside him for a long time. The cattle lowed outside. The wind was soft. The smell of the trench, sour, sharp, alive, came through the window and mixed with the cold coffee smell and the stove smoke smell and the earth and wool smell of the blankets. And Clara breathed it all in and let it fill the place where the crying would come later, when she had finished the work that Baptiste had helped her begin. She buried him on the rise above the trench, beside the spoil pile from the digging, where the clay was soft enough to take a grave without a pick. She carved his name and years on a plank from the cap scraps and drove it into the dirt. No preacher, no neighbors, just Clara and the sound of the wind and the cattle and the creak of the windmill frame that Ellis had never finished, and that Baptiste had never offered to repair because he understood that some things are not yours to fix. There is a kind of silence that comes after a person who taught you something essential is gone. It is not empty silence. It is the silence of a room where the lesson still echoes, where the words have soaked into the walls and the floor and the hands that did the work, and where the absence of the voice makes the knowledge louder, not quieter. Clara carried that silence for the rest of her life. She never spoke of Baptiste as a helper or a rescuer. She spoke of him as a man who remembered what his father knew and had the grace to share it with someone who needed it at the right time. The secondary crisis came in the following winter, and it came without Baptiste. Clara had spent the summer and fall of 1887 rebuilding. She planted 12 acres of fodder corn, 3 more than the year before, and filled the original trench plus a smaller second trench she had dug with Wallace's help. The second trench was 20 feet long and 10 wide, sized for Wallace's reduced herd, and Clara supervised its construction with a precision that surprised Wallace, who had expected her to be approximate. 4 inches per layer, Clara told him as they filled. Not 6, not 8, 4. Each layer trampled until you cannot push a fork into it. 4 is slow. 4 is tight. 6 is fast and loose and full of air pockets that will spoil by Christmas. Wallace packed at 4 inches. Thomas drove the horses. Clara checked the edges with her hands, pressing her fingers into the seam between corn and earth wall, feeling for the gaps that would let air in and fermentation turn to rot. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it before their own winter comes. By October, both trenches were sealed. Clara's larger trench held roughly 55 tons. Wallace's held 18. Together, they could carry Clara's herd and Wallace's surviving cattle through a hard winter with feed to spare. The crisis came in December, and it came not from Clara's trench, but from Driscoll's. Driscoll had built his own trench that fall, following Clara's instructions as closely as he could remember them. He had cut his corn green, chopped it short, packed it in layers, and sealed it with earth. But he had skipped the clay seal beneath the earth cap, relying on the weight of the dirt alone, and he had built the trench on flat ground near a creek bed instead of on a rise. Coyotes dug into the south end in mid-December. They did not reach the corn. The earth was deep enough to stop them, but they cracked the cap, and rain seeped through the crack and into the grass mat, and through the grass mat into the corn. Within a week, the south end of Driscoll's trench was heating. The fermentation, which should have stabilized at a low temperature under a tight seal, had reactivated in the presence of air and moisture, and the temperature inside the mass was climbing. Driscoll rode to Clara's place in a panic. "The trench is hot," he said. "I can feel it through the cap. It smells wrong. It smells sweet, not sour." Clara went with him. She knelt beside the south end and pressed her hand to the earth. It was warm, not the faint, steady warmth of healthy fermentation, but a sharper heat, the kind that meant the bacteria had shifted from lactic acid production to something else, something that produced heat and gas and would eventually produce rot. She dug into the cap at the damaged section. The coyote hole was small, but the rain had widened it, and the water had traveled along the plank layer for several feet before soaking into the corn. The affected area was 4 feet long. The corn beneath it was brown, soft, and hot to the touch. It smelled of alcohol and something acrid that made Clara's eyes sting. "This section is gone," she said. "Cut it out." "Cut it out? You mean dig it up?" Dig out the spoiled face. Go past the brown to where the corn is still yellow-green and firm. Pack the new edge tight. Seal the cap with clay over the cut. If the rest of the trench is intact, you will lose 4 feet of feed and save the rest. How do you know the rest is intact? Because the heat is only here. Feel the cap 3 feet further. Clara moved along the trench. Driscoll followed. The earth beyond the damaged section was cool. The smell, when Clara pressed her nose to the ground, was the sharp vinegar tang of good fermentation. "Here," she said, "this is the line. Everything south of here comes out. Everything north stays sealed." Driscoll and his son-in-law dug out the spoiled section. Clara supervised. She made them cut past the brown corn by an extra 6 inches, into feed that looked sound, because she remembered what Baptiste had told her about margins. "My father always cut further than he thought he needed to," she had said, and now she said it to Driscoll. "The spoilage you can see is not the edge of the spoilage. The edge is 6 inches further in, where the color is still good, but the bacteria have already shifted. Cut past it." They repacked the new face, sealed the cap with wet clay, and piled earth over the repair. The rest of the trench opened clean in January. Driscoll lost 4 feet of feed out of 25. His cattle ate through the winter on what remained, supplemented with hay and brush. Clara had diagnosed the problem, prescribed the solution, and supervised the repair without Baptiste. She had applied his lessons, the smell test, the temperature test, the margin cut, the clay seal, from memory and from the practiced knowledge in her hands. The knowledge was no longer inherited. It was hers. Sykes used Driscoll's failure as ammunition. In Mobeetie, he told anyone who would listen that Driscoll's trench had nearly gone bad, that the method was unreliable, that one cracked cap meant 50 tons of poison, and that next time it might be an animal that died instead of a section of feed. Clara heard about it from Wallace. She went to Mobeetie the following day and stood in Pruitt's store in front of 3 ranchers and Pruitt himself, and answered Sykes without raising her voice. "Driscoll's trench cracked because he did not use a clay seal, and he built on flat ground near water," she said. "The method did not fail. The construction failed. A house that burns because the chimney has no mortar does not prove that houses are dangerous. It proves that mortar matters." One of the ranchers, a man named Sadler who had lost his entire small herd, asked, "How do you know yours will not crack?" "Because mine is on a rise. The cap has 3 layers and I check it every day. If it cracks, I seal it. If coyotes dig, I fill the hole and add clay. The trench is not a box you seal and forget. It is a living system that you manage. The corn is fermenting. Fermentation requires conditions. If you maintain the conditions, the system holds. If you neglect it, it fails. That is not magic. That is work." Sykes was not in the store, but word reached him. A system anyone could build, anyone could manage, and anyone could teach reduced his value with each conversation Clara had. His hay was still necessary. Clara had never claimed otherwise, but it was no longer the only hope, and hope that had been a monopoly was now a market, and markets do not favor the man who benefited from scarcity. Amos Rudd stood in the back of the store during Clara's explanation. He did not speak until she finished. Then he said, to no one in particular, "I have sent 2 of my men to build a trench on the north section. Clara Danner is supervising." The room was quiet. Clara looked at Rudd. He looked back. Between them something settled that did not need to be spoken, the acknowledgement that a man who had dismissed her from horseback was now standing on her ground and pointing other men toward it. The winter of 1887 to 1888 tested the method a second time, and this time Clara was not the only one watching. Rudd's two men built their trench on the north section of his range in September under Clara's direction. She rode out 3 times during the construction, once to mark the site, once to inspect the taper, and once to supervise the cap. The men were experienced ranch hands who took orders from Amos Rudd without question, but who looked at Clara with the careful blankness of men trying very hard not to show that they were uncomfortable taking instruction from a woman. Clara did not care about their comfort. She cared about the taper angle. She cared about the drainage. She cared about the 4-inch layers and the trampling and the edge packing and the clay seal. The corners, she told them. Again, I can fit 2 fingers in the gap. Ma'am, the horses packed it 3 times. Horses pack the center. The corners pack by hand. Use the post. Ram it until you cannot push a blade between the corn and the wall. They rammed. The corners tightened. Clara checked them with her own fingers and nodded. She did not praise the work. She moved to the next section. Wallace Kerr filled his second trench in October. He had expanded it to 24 feet, 4 feet longer than the year before, and he had hired Thomas and a neighbor's boy to help with the cutting. His technique had improved. The chopping was uniform, the layers were tight, and he had built the cap with clay, grass, and 3 feet of earth, exactly as Clara had specified. Driscoll built a new trench on a rise, with a clay seal and an earth cap thick enough to stop anything short of a man with a pick. 2 other small ranchers, Sadler and a man named Bryce, built their first trenches under Clara's supervision. She charged nothing. She gave her time the way Baptiste had given his, because the knowledge was not hers to sell. It was hers to pass. But the teaching was not charity in the way Mobeedi understood charity. Clara made every man and woman who wanted to learn work a day on her own operation first. They helped cut. They helped chop. They helped pack. They learned the feel of properly compressed corn under their hands, the smell of good fermentation in their noses, the weight of a forkful measured by shoulder strain. Only after they had done the work did Clara draw the dimensions in the dirt and send them home to build. If you have not packed a trench, you cannot build one, she told Mrs. Prentice, who had returned with her husband in tow. The husband, a thick-necked man named Galen Prentice, who had refused to come the first time, stood with his hands in his pockets and his mouth shut while his wife and Clara discussed cutting schedules. The measurements are simple. The labor is not. The labor teaches you what the measurements cannot. Galen Prentice built a trench that fall. His wife supervised the packing. Sykes made his last calculated move in September of 1888, and it was the move that broke him. He had watched the trenches multiply through the summer with the cold focus of a man counting the cost of someone else's success. Every trench filled was a customer lost. Every rancher who grew fodder corn was a rancher who did not need to buy Sykes's hay at winter prices. The feed monopoly that had given him leverage over every small outfit in Wheeler County was contracting, trench by trench, and Sykes responded the only way he knew how. He doubled down. He bought hay. He bought more hay than he had ever bought, contracting with ranches south of the Canadian and east of the Panhandle for bales that he stockpiled in his yard behind the locked fence. His calculation was simple, and from his position, rational. If the winter of '88 was as bad as '87, hay would be worth a fortune again, and the trenches, which were new, untested at scale, built by amateurs, would fail, and the ranchers who had trusted Clara's method would come crawling back to the only man with real feed. The winter of '88 was not as bad as '87. It was ordinary. Cold, but not catastrophic. Snow, but not the crusted ice that had sealed the grass. The cattle that had been fed from trenches came through in a good condition. The cattle that relied on hay came through as well, because the hay lasted long enough in a mild winter. But Sykes's hay sat in his yard. He had bought on credit, expecting to sell at panic prices, and the panic never came. A wet spell in late January soaked the exposed bales on the outer rows. The bales molded. The mold spread to the inner rows. By February, a third of Sykes's stockpile was dark, wet, and sour in the wrong way, not the controlled sourness of fermented corn, but the rot of neglected hay that had been left to weather. He tried to sell the damaged bales. He dropped the price. He dropped it again. Ranchers who had trenches did not need his hay at any price. Ranchers who did not have trenches looked at the moldy bales and refused. Amos Rudd delivered the public verdict. He had ridden to Sykes's yard with two of his men to inspect a load he had ordered before the winter. He looked at the bales. He pulled one apart and smelled the interior. He dropped it on the ground. "I will take sour corn before sweet rot," Rudd said. He said it loudly enough for the three other men in the yard to hear. He mounted and rode out without buying a single bale. The sentence traveled through Mobeetie the way sentences do in small towns, faster than horses and louder than guns. By evening, everyone had heard it: sour corn before sweet rot. The word settled over Sykes's business like a cap over a trench, and what they sealed in was the knowledge that the man who had mocked Clara's method now had a yard full of ruined feed and a stack of debts that his monopoly could no longer cover. Sykes came to Clara's place on a Tuesday evening in March. He came alone. He did not bring clerks or cowboys or the posture of authority. He dismounted at the fence and stood with his hat in his hands, and Clara saw something in his face she had never seen before. Not humility. Sykes was not capable of humility, but the absence of alternatives, which in a certain light looks the same. "I need silage," he said, "for the livery horses. They're thin, and I have no feed that is not spoiled." Clara looked at him. She thought about the notice. She thought about the day he had ridden to her trench with two clerks and accused her of destroying collateral. She thought about the phrase, "a woman who buries feed," and the phrase, "sour poison," and the phrase, "the kind of thing a woman does when she has no man left to tell her it is foolish." She did not say any of those things back to him. Revenge is a luxury that costs more than it pays, and Clara had learned from her father that the best answer to a man who wronged you is a transaction that leaves you better off, and him aware of it. "I have feed," Clara said. "I will sell you enough for the livery horses at fair price. $4 a ton. That is what I would charge anyone." $4. $4, and the note is paid from the proceeds. "I will sell you $35 of silage. You will mark the remaining balance on my note as settled. You will sign the receipt in front of witnesses." That is the price. The feed price is fair. The note settlement is math. You hold $138 on a herd that is worth 4 times that now. You can forgive $35 of paper and walk away with feed for your horses, or you can refuse and explain to the livery owner why his horses are thin while your yard is full of rot. Sykes stood at the fence for a long time. The wind blew. The cattle in Clara's lot chewed cud and watched him with the indifference of animals that have been fed well enough to forget what hunger felt like. "Who witnesses?" he said. "Wallace Kerr and Amos Rudd." "Rudd? Rudd?" Sykes came back the next day with a pen and a ledger. Wallace stood on one side. Amos Rudd stood on the other. Sykes signed the receipt that marked $35 paid against the note. Clara forked silage into his wagon while the 3 men stood in silence. The sound of the fork entering the feed face, the soft, dense compression of fermented corn giving way to steel, was the only sound in the yard. When the wagon was loaded, Sykes did not thank her. He climbed onto the seat and drove toward Mobeetie. Clara watched him go and felt the weight of the note lighten by $35, which was not enough to clear it, but was enough to prove that the balance had shifted. She was no longer the debtor begging for time. She was the creditor's creditor, selling him the thing he had said would never work. She paid the rest of the note by summer in installments from cattle sales and silage sales, and a small contract to supervise trench construction for a ranch near Canadian. When the last dollar was recorded and the note was marked satisfied, Clara folded the paper and put it in the same pocket where she had carried the original notice. She did not burn it. She kept it because the paper was evidence of something she did not want to forget. Not the debt, but the fact that she had paid it with buried corn and a dead man's memory. Daniel Wexler arrived in Clara's life through a broken gear. The hand-cranked feed cutter that Baptiste had rigged from salvaged parts broke down in August of 1888, halfway through the cutting season. The blade hinge cracked and the frame twisted, and Clara spent a morning trying to straighten it with a hammer and a vise before admitting that metal was not her language. She hauled the cutter to Canadian, where a blacksmith and general repairman named Wexler had a shop near the courthouse. Daniel Wexler was 34, widowed 2 years earlier when his wife had died of typhoid, and he was the kind of man who looked at broken things the way Clara looked at trenches, with attention, patience, and the belief that understanding the failure was the first step toward fixing it. He turned the cutter over in his hands. He found the crack. He found the twist. He found the place where Baptiste's original weld had been too thin, where the stress of 1,000 cuts had worked the metal until it separated. "The design is good," he said. "The weld is not. I can build you a stronger frame and a heavier hinge. What are you cutting?" "Green corn, thumb-length pieces, about 9 acres a season." Wexler looked at her. "By hand?" "By hand in this machine, which is now neither." He built her a new cutter in a week. The frame was heavier, the hinge was forged from a single piece instead of welded, and the blade was wider, which meant each stroke cut more corn. When Clara came to pick it up, she tested it on a stalk he had kept from his own garden. The stalk sheared cleanly. The pieces were uniform. The machine did not shake. "What do I owe you?" Clara asked. $2 for the iron. The labor is on account." "I do not keep accounts with men I do not know." "Then come back when you know me and pay what you think is fair." Clara took the cutter home. She used it through the fall. It was the best tool she owned, and every time she pressed the handle and heard the clean sound of the blade passing through corn, she thought of the man who had built it and the way he had turned the broken machine in his hands as if it were telling him something only he could hear. Wexler came to her place in October, officially to check whether the cutter was holding. He found Clara packing the second trench with Wallace's help. He watched for 20 minutes without speaking. Then he walked to the edge and looked at the packed face. "What is this?" Clara explained. She did not simplify. She gave him the dimensions, the taper, the chemistry, the cutting schedule, the packing method, the cap construction. She talked the way she talked to ranchers who came to learn, see, with numbers, with specifics, with the assumption that the listener was capable of understanding. Wexler listened the way he had examined the cutter, with the full attention of a man who respects what he is looking at. When she finished, he said, "You need a better edge seal. The corn is pulling away from the wall at the taper line. If you let me forge a set of iron tamping bars curved to match the wall angle, you could pack the edges tighter than a fence post allows." Clara looked at him. No one had ever suggested an improvement to the method. People came to learn it as she taught it. This man had seen it once and found a way to make it better. "Make the bars," she said, "and I will pay you for the cutter." He made the bars. They were 3 feet long, curved at the tip to match the trench wall's taper, and heavy enough to compress the edge corn without Clara having to swing a post. The packing improved. The edge spoilage, in the following winter, was less than half an inch. Wexler came back. He came to repair the windmill frame that Ellis had never finished, and that Clara had not had the ironwork skills to complete. He came to build a hinge for the shed door. He came to look at the trench and suggest a plank-sided above-ground silo for the overflow corn that the trench could not hold. The courtship happened through metal and corn. Wexler built. Clara directed. He learned not to explain her own method back to her after she corrected his packing technique on a November afternoon, and he realized that the woman he was courting understood compression and fermentation better than he understood iron, which was saying something. They married in the spring of 1889. Clara's note was cleared. Her herd had grown to 52 head from the calves born that spring. The marriage was her choice, not her rescue, and she made that distinction clear to everyone who offered congratulations by continuing to manage the trench operation herself. Daniel built frames and repaired machines. Clara decided when to cut, when to fill, when to seal, and when to open. The years compressed the way years do when the work is steady and the crises become smaller. Clara and Daniel built a proper house in 1890 on the same rise where the dugout had been, using lumber from Canadian and windows that Daniel freighted in on his own wagon. They raised 2 children. The older, a girl named Marte, named for Clara's mother, helped with the cutting by the time she was 9. The younger, a boy named Ellis, helped with the packing by the time he was 7. In 1892, Wallace Kerr's wife died of fever, and his niece, a girl of 11 named Sarah, was orphaned. Clara and Daniel took her in. Sarah learned the trench method the way Clara had learned sauerkraut, by watching, by doing, by developing the feel in her hands that no amount of description could replace. Clara kept a ledger. Every year, she recorded the planting date, the cutting date, the weather during filling, the trench dimensions, the fill height, the amount of salt used, the date of the seal, the date of the first opening, the spoilage depth, the number of cattle fed, the daily ration, and the losses. The ledger became a practical manual. Neighbors borrowed it. They copied the numbers. They returned it with thumbprints and stain marks that Clara did not mind, because stains meant the book had been used in the field, where it belonged. By 1895, 7 outfits within riding distance of Sweetwater Creek maintained trench silos. Not all of them worked perfectly. One cracked in a dry spell and lost the south end. Another was packed too wet and the bottom layers soured past usefulness. But the ones that held, the ones built on rises with clay seals and proper caps, packed at 4 inches and trampled until a fork could not penetrate, opened clean in winter and fed cattle that survived. Clara held a filling day once a year in September. Neighbors brought their own corn and their own horses, and they filled Clara's trench and their own in rotation, trading labor the way farmers had traded labor since labor began. The filling days became events, not celebrations exactly, but gatherings where the work was shared, and the knowledge passed sideways from person to person. Clara supervised. Daniel maintained the cutters. Marte and Ellis and Sarah packed edges. Amos Rudd died in 1896, old enough that the trail drives he had bossed were stories told by men who had been boys. He never stopped calling Clara by the name he had given her after the first winter. "The best feed boss in Wheeler County," he would say, and it was not a joke. It was the highest compliment a man who had bossed cattle his entire life knew how to give. Sykes left Mobeetie in 1893. He sold the feed business and the store to a man from Clarendon and moved south to a town where no one knew his name, or the story of the note, or the yard full of molded hay. Clara heard he died somewhere near San Angelo. She did not attend the funeral. She did not send word. The ledger did not record his departure or his death. The trenches evolved. By the turn of the century, some ranchers in the Panhandle had built above-ground silos from planks and tar paper, taller structures that held more feed in less ground space. Younger men called it a modern technique. Clara smiled when she heard that, the way a woman smiles when someone describes her grandmother's recipe as a new discovery. She lived into the early years of the new century, long enough to see barbed wire replace drift fences, long enough to see the railroad reach towns that had been 2 days' ride when she arrived, long enough to see her children grow and her grandchildren begin, and to watch a neighbor's son, fresh from an agricultural college, build a concrete silo and explain the chemistry of lactic acid fermentation as if no one in Wheeler County had ever heard the word before. Clara did not correct him. She handed him the ledger and told him to read the entry for 1886. He read it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if he could copy it, and Clara said yes. By the spring of 1888, 7 neighboring outfits set aside fodder corn for the first time instead of trusting grass and purchased hay alone. 3 of them built trenches under Clara's supervision. 1 failed. The cap cracked after a dry wind pulled moisture from the clay, and rain entered before the damage was found. The rancher lost the east end, but the others opened clean. Their cattle came through the winter standing, and the men who had watched Clara dump green corn into a hole in the ground 2 years earlier did not laugh about it anymore. Clara Voss Danner lived out her later years on the same rise above Sweetwater Creek in the house Daniel built where the dugout had been. She was no longer the widow men tried to advise. She was the person they came to before the weather changed. Her ledger passed through local hands for years, its pages stained with silage juice and stove smoke, and the thumbprints of men and women who had carried it into the field and opened it beside a trench they were learning to fill. When Clara died, the ledger went to Marte, who kept it in a drawer beside her mother's sickle and a coffee tin that smelled faintly and permanently of vinegar and corn. Snow covered the flats above Sweetwater Creek the way it always covered them in January. Sudden, hard, driven by a north wind that had nothing between it and the horizon to slow it down. 2 cowboys from the LX range had stopped on the road years earlier and watched a widow drag green corn toward a hole that was not yet dug. One of them had said, "She is burying summer because she cannot stack winter." The words had drifted across Wheeler County the way all words drift in small places, carried by wind and repetition until they became a sentence everyone knew and no one remembered for saying. But the answer to that sentence was not a sentence. It was a sound. Cattle standing shoulder to shoulder at a feed bunk on the worst morning of the worst winter in Panhandle memory, steam rising from their noses, the crunch of fermented corn between their teeth, and Clara Danner cutting back the frozen earth with a pick, forking out yellow-green feed from under black dirt, her breath white in the cold, her hands steady, the trench giving back what she had buried. Not summer, but the knowledge that summer could be kept.